Hi everybody, welcome to the Anti-Racist webinar which has been hosted by BASW England in collaboration with the Chief Social Workers Office, DHSC. My name is Jason Brandon. I am the Mental Health Social Work Lead based in the Chief Social Workers Office, and I'm delighted to be able to chair this session which is focused on taking responsibility to address racism in practice, particularly, as I say, with a focus against the AMP role. I am talking to you with the benefit of hindsight of knowing that the webinar has been delivered. It was fantastic, but due to the fact that we had some technical problems at the beginning, the recording that we're posting will be at the moment without an introduction. So this is an added introduction. We will splice this onto the beginning, so you will see a seamless recording where the main recording that was delivered on the 17th of October will follow my additional recording now. So that remains for me to mention the star-studded lineup of speakers that we have who are talking in the webinar, who are really bringing a focus to practice, anti-racism in practice, particularly around Mental Health Act assessment work. We have Dr. Colin King, who is a former AMP and registered social worker, and somebody who has been assessed under the Mental Health Act and subsequently detained. He brings a vast amount of experience and some really powerful commentary for your consideration. We then build on Dr. King's experience and bring in an academic research perspective led by Dr. Caroline Lee. Caroline is a senior lecturer in Manchester Met University. She's continuing to progress with a range of research projects and brings, again, a really, really powerful perspective in terms of the evidence that we're building on our knowledge upon. Dr. Jacqui Dyer and Husnara Malik are our colleagues from NHSE who are developing the PCREF, the Patient Care Race Equality Framework, essentially an anti-racism framework. Really, really important to see the policy initiatives and to build up our relationship with that and to understand the tools that we can acquire to be able to bring those into practice and assert some leverage across the system. Neil Sanyal and Shantel Thomas have kindly agreed to join us and deliver a conversational piece in their roles as practicing social workers, social work leads in their respective organisations. Neil, as many of you will know, is a practicing AMP, and I know now, with the benefit of hindsight, they deliver a really, really interesting and stimulating session. And then we hear from a panel. So the panel of speakers that I've described, who are joined by Ahmed Lilo, who is the chair of the National BAME AMP Network, and Robert Lewis, who is the co-chair of the AMP Leads Network. So without further ado, I will be quiet and I'll hand over to Dr. Colin King, and you will see my recording now seamlessly leading into the main webinar, which I know you will enjoy. Thank you very much, and speak to you soon.
Own epistemological perspective to AMP's work. Just go to the next slide. So this can break it down into three parts, really looking at what does an anti-racist conceptual tool look like to a new type of professionalism. And I think to begin to analyse it, we need to break it down into three specific components. The history of theories of race that inform that relationship, what has been the impact on the lived experiences as a personal narrative, and also what does a lived experience anti-racist perspective actually look like in collaboration and in co-production with a new social work approach to mental health. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm actually saying to begin to address anti-racism, we need to look at how it's been informed historically by particular philosophers, founding fathers of psychiatry and philosophy. These are people that inform the relationship between the AMP, the police, and the consultant psychiatrists. And I'm really concerned and disturbed that a lot of the theories that we use are informed by a eugenic approach to mental health and race. From Kaplan, who perceives people as weak, but more importantly, Henry Maudsley, who runs the mental health unit at Maudsley, actually used the word that we have no capacity to moral feelings. And Freud, who's actually very essential to the way we look at the world in in terms of the AMP's perspective, actually said people of colour are uncivilized. So that really concerns me about how do we shift and challenge these historical perspectives.
Colin, sorry to interrupt your flow.
yeah.
Sorry, just in the chat, people are struggling to hear you only because of that. There seems to be an issue with the feedback.
Hello?
Yeah, that sounds a bit better. The feedback's gone, certainly from my end. Should we take it from there? Are you okay to carry on? That made a difference. People putting their thumbs up.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best thumbs I'll get up for being more clearer. So thank you very much for that. Is that a lot clearer now?
It's the feedback just has come back a little bit, but yeah, if you could speak up a little bit, I think that would be really helpful.
Okay, so I'm really concerned about the historic impact of modern European theories and how it impacts the relationship with the AMP's perception of race and anti-racism over the last 400 years. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to try to say that the AMP is captured in a cultural schizophrenic zone. It's captured in how it looks at racialized lenses through the work of Cartwright. Cartwright made a distinction about the disease of the mind, which is encapsulated in our mental health section 1. But also, what we need to look at, if we're going to look at anti-racism, is the gap between the relationship, what Littlewood Lipscomb called cultural schizophrenia. This is the social, political, and cultural differences between people with lived experiences. And these experiences are accelerated if we look at the relationship between the biomedical approach and systemic cultural racism. But if we look, how do we then address and empower the Black reality as a modern anti-racist perspective? So I'm looking at Fanon. How do we then look at the types of performances and scripts that inform that relationship? How do we use Black theorists like Wilson to look at the AMP is actually informed in the behavioural control of the Black experience through the last 40 years? Just going on to the next one. Is that clearer?
We're still getting a buzzing sound, Colin.
We're still getting a bit of feedback, but by speaking a lot louder is really helpful.
Yeah, I do apologise for this.
That's better. That's better. Your feedback seems to have gone now.
Okay, and so what I've decided to do is analyse what has been the impact in terms of the AMP relationship over a 600-year period from 1651. And if we begin to look at that, with all the changes in legislation, the Capacity Act, the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, the CARE Act, it's not led to any radical changes in terms of experiences and outcomes. I'm not going to go into a data analysis. I think Jacqui and all the others will do that much more clearly. But I'm concerned in this 400 years, why has anti-racism failed in mental health liberation of the Black experience? It really concerns me. And I'm going to begin to articulate that in terms of the lived experience in the next section. So what I began to do, and I watched the video of your anti-racist conference in 2020. I was up all night watching that. And I began to look at, so what are these anti-racist perspectives that we've actually developed since the 65, 68 and 75 Race Relations Act, when we were based upon a critical race theory to radical social work? When I think the AMP was more of an advocate of the state, but it didn't actually decrease the number of Black people admitted onto mental health. Actually, year on, with different racialized perspectives, it has not actually changed the relationship and the experiences of Black people in the mental health system. To the point is what are we doing in this type in 2023? Are we moving towards a bureaucratization of race, where we're actually looking at anti-racism rather than looking at race equality? So I actually applaud the Mental Health Review Act because it addresses some really critical changes in our anti-racist policies and procedures that may lead to changes, but at times I'm very critical and actually negative about, is it going to decrease the level of admissions to a mental health ward? If we go on to the next slide, my personal experiences is based upon 3 different factors. Firstly, I was imprisoned and sectioned under the Mental Health Act 1959, where I endured and experienced the types of theories that we talked about eugenics. I heard voices of my own cultural despair, which were defined as schizophrenia, also known as DSM-5. But what I learned in that experience from being sectioned on a prison, transferred to Maudsley Hospital to become an ASW, that co-production was a mythology, that lived experience knowledge was denied in how people were assessed under the Mental Health Act, and also how AMPs were actually representing and advocating for the experiences. To the time now, we are now in what I call the post-production stage, where there is little parity between lived experience and the approved mental health practitioner, which is a really critical issue that I think we need to begin to look at later on. But if I just go to the next slide, I'm going to actually try and look at something that's quite sad in my personal history, that I feel as a person diagnosed with schizophrenia, was I transferring those theories through the AMP relationship in terms of my own containment. These are my two sons, both of which I tried my best to stop them from experiencing breakdowns. One actually tried to commit suicide. This is very recently. The other one was sectioned under the Mental Health Act to the very ward that I was sectioned. But then I reflected on this really painful experience. As an AMP, I sectioned over 250 black men during a 20-year period. And then this week, we really tried to reflect about what is happening in this relationship between the black experiences, particularly black men, and AMPs and police and the consultant that's leading to this repetitive outcome. And I'm just going to address what I think is actually happening in this stage of part one of this presentation in the next slide. Because what I think is really happening is this. We are still obsessed with the fear of black men, the demonization and dehumanization and configuration of one of the most important cases in modern history that shaped a risk approach to anti-racism. And I think this is comes up very strongly in the work of Stone's study in 2019, that we are still looking at risk rather than behavior. We're still looking at strengths of black families as actually a deficit model from an Afrocentric perspective. We are looking at the fear of the black space within the white space. And that's why I think that the mental health legislation is a criminal justice. It's a dehumanization of the black experience. I'm going to finish on one slide before I move over, so I stick to the time, which is probably one of the saddest moments in our modern social history, that when the AMP is becoming an advocate of a new depomania. This is, and you should all know this person because he's the icon of a most social history and change in mental health history. But in 2010, 13 years to the day, somebody came into the ward on an informal patient, ended up being sectioned, ended up being handcuffed, and actually died. So this is indicative of the challenge that when anti-racism gets it wrong, we lose lives. When we fail to work in co-production and collaboration, we depoliticize the black experience and we dehumanize it to the state where at the AMP becomes a person who represents a modern slave system, a repetition of a new type of depomania. Thank you very much.
Colin, thank you very much indeed for setting the tone of the webinar today. And colleagues, you'll be hearing more from Colin towards the end of the webinar. I want to really point out that we brought the webinar into being today absolutely with the perspective of hearing and understanding the lived experience of being detained for people from racialised communities. And I'm delighted that we've been able to hear from Colin with his various personal and professional experience. But we're also joined by Dr. Caroline Lee to provide an academic perspective. And you'll then go on to hear from policy colleagues from NHSE, Jacqui Dyer and Husnara Malik. And you'll hear from practitioners working as AMPs, but giving an experience of allyship and understanding anti-racist perspectives from their particular approach. I'm hoping that you'll be able to gather a rounded perspective in your role on the front line as being a key instrument in the Mental Health Act to tackle inequality. And we've brought the webinar and the theme of the webinar to bear in terms of challenging your practice and for you to be able to take away some learning and some professional development in terms of improving your approach to anti-racism within your AMP work. So I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Caroline Lee. Caroline, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you also to Colin for a really interesting start to today's anti-racism webinar. We're very fortunate on the Improve Act research team to have Colin as a colleague and as someone with expert by experience too, who's been guiding us throughout this study. So what I'm going to talk about today is it's an NIHR funded study. It's one of 4 studies that was funded under the Mental Health Act reform, one of 4 policy pathway projects. And our project is a cross-disciplinary project, and it's concerned with looking at the mental health professional experiences of supporting UK, Black African Caribbean men who have been detained under the Mental Health Act. That's one part of this overarching project that I'm going to present today. The lead for the project is Professor Joy Duxbury, OBE, and Dr. Alina Haynes-Delmott is the project manager. Could I have the next slide, please? Because I don't seem to be able to take control for some reason. Just go back one. Thank you. Okay, so that's the overarching project. So you'll see there that we're also using a conceptual framework called the Silences Framework, which has been devised by Professor Laura Sarant, which looks at things that perhaps have previously been hidden, things that have been unsaid, where we've got dominant perspectives, and we utilise people who've got lived experience to really look and think about how those dominant perspectives are entering into professionals' understanding of different types of racialised ideas and identities. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the project there. So if you do want to have a little bit more of a look at it, then do go to that link on the slide. I presume the slides are going to be available at the end of this webinar. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Colin has actually set out the context, excellently, but just to put a little bit more on that, we're currently finalising a systematic review as part of this project, and what we're finding is that nothing has actually changed in the last 20 years. The detention experience is broadly the same, the number of admissions is increasing, so whatever we're doing, we're not affecting any positive change. And we know, obviously, and you know as AMPs, that the statistics are out there that Black and African Caribbean men are detained under the Act more than twice as long as white British men, and when they are detained, they do experience more coercive care, and that includes, as we just heard from Colin with Seni, higher rates of control and restraint, more use of injected antipsychotic medication, higher rates of seclusion when in an inpatient setting, and that vicious cycle of repeat admissions as well, that revolving door. We also know that Black and African Caribbean men are less likely to be offered psychological therapies, and when they are offered it, they're less likely to continue with it than white male counterparts. And we know, because of these experiences, which aren't new to us, we know that the framing of these experiences is such that mental health care has been branded as institutionally racist. And we also know that there's a risk narrative as part of that institutional racism, which Colin touched upon earlier. So some of the explanations for increased risk of detainment from the literature include an increased prevalence of psychosis, an increased perceived risk of violence, a mistrust of GPs, increased police contact, and other ethnic disparities. And we also know from Keating that there's a fear of experiencing racism from Black and African Caribbean men, and there's a fear of stigma that comes with being diagnosed with a mental illness and a fear of being detained. And all these factors are woven in together. So we know that inequalities and disparities within this context comes from a very dominant white Eurocentric model of care and treatment, and within a historical context of colonialism too. And we know as well that research that we're finding as part of the systematic review, and the research is very much limited by ethnic groups, not just Black and African Caribbean men, but other minority ethnic groups being amalgamated, homogenised, and intersectionalities are often invisibilised. So, you know, where we might have a paper and a piece of research that's accounting for ethnicity, we're not really seeing the intersectionalities that might occur with gender or with sexuality, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the overarching project. So you can see there's 4 major arms there. I'm going to be talking about the interviews that have been held by myself with professionals today. But you'll also see that there are community engagement activities with people with lived experience. There's a systematic review, which should be out shortly. And we're also engaged in a range of parliamentary symposiums and roundtable events too, as part of our engagement work with Policy Connect. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the arm of the project that I'm concerned with. So I've been interviewing a variety of different health and social care professionals who've been involved in the detention process. They are psychiatrists, police professionals, clinical psychologists, and a mental health liaison nurse so far. And what we're doing is we're looking at their experiences. The whole project is about experiences, so professional experiences, and the lived experiences as well, because what we found in the past with research, it was about views and opinions, and we want to know more about the emotional engagement in this work, and what some of the barriers are, and we're doing that by asking people what their experiences are. So we're analysing those transcripts at the moment, and there will be a feedback event with various different professional groups to validate the findings and to identify priorities for change. So what we want to do is to really look at what professionals think is not working, what's not going well, and what they want to change, and any ideas for good practice going forward that can be co-designed as a future intervention as part of the study. Once that's been discussed, then there will be a further event where people with lived experience will come together if they feel comfortable to do so, with the professionals, and we will look at co-creating an intervention for change. And we will, you know, we don't know what that's going to look like yet, but we're getting some good ideas coming forward, which I'm happy to take questions on later. Okay, next stage, please. Next slide. So I thought it'd be really helpful as AMHS just to talk through some of the interview findings with professionals. So what we're finding is, like many of you in the room today, you understand the complexities of all the structural factors on people's lived experiences, on Black and African Caribbean men's experience of mental health care and their treatment. So, as AMHS, you've got a really good understanding of the impact of poverty on somebody's life, the impact of racism and trauma, both historical and current, and the intersections really of people who have been unfortunately abused or currently or historically have misused drug and alcohol. But what we also are noting is that many of the professionals who have been interviewed self-declare that they feel they've got a very limited understanding of the cultural and support needs for Black and African Caribbean men experiencing mental health illness and mental health crises. And they agree predominantly that the concept of whiteness, as defined by Kivel, is the dominant lens through which services have been designed and are currently delivered, which is obviously a major barrier for practice. And what we're also finding are that there are a lot of issues in terms of the pathways for people who need crisis support. And many of the pathways, such as early intervention or community services, feel very much hidden to Black and African Caribbean men. And the narrative as such does need to change. It's services that are hard to reach and often inappropriate, unfit for purpose for Black and African Caribbean men, rather than BAC men being hard to reach. And obviously we've seen that that's been a very fixed narrative for some time, that BAC men are very hard to reach and such like. So we need to really flip that narrative and investigate more deeply, more sensitively, why these pathways are unsuitable. What we're also finding is that post-discharge follow-up is very procedural. It's a tick box exercise. It's not trauma informed. People post-discharge aren't asked about their experience of being on a ward, what the sectioning experience was like for them. There's no additional wraparound care. It's just very procedural. You're back in the community, you're back on your care plan, go to the depot clinic, take your depot, everything will be okay. And we need more psychological therapeutic support post-discharge. We also find that family involvement is often hidden, unseen, and sometimes even unrecognised by some professionals. And we also are hearing that mental health interventions are complex due to professionals' sometimes different perceptions of risk. And there's particularly quite different narratives around risk between the police and AMPS, and some quite horrendous examples actually within the interview data of the police being extremely coercive, extremely heavy-handed, and physically hurting the person who needs to be detained without sufficient understanding of what that person's risk profile is. And I think that very much links in with the narrative that Colin was describing of the physicality as perceived by police officers of Black men being big, black and dangerous, and we're seeing that coming through. And we're also finding that the stigma amongst Black communities too, regarding severe and enduring mental health issues, which is severely impeding those members from seeking help and support from traditional mental health services. And obviously we can see that that would be understandable when the stories of those experiences of Black men are getting into the community, why those communities would be fearful really of asking for help for their loved ones. Next slide, please. So just to give you some examples of some of the data that's coming through. So interview participant 4, when they were discussing, talking to professionals, said, I think as well for men, they do find it harder to talk about their mental health. I don't think there's as many Black and African Caribbean men that talk positively about mental health services and what they offer if you engage with them. It's the narrative in society of you're a Black and African Caribbean man. I don't think it would encourage you to go and seek help from mental health services. So obviously that is a major barrier. If you don't feel the trust is there to go and seek appropriate support, or when the support is there and it's not culturally adapted and culturally sensitive to those needs, then we're in a position where the person who is in crisis isn't going to get the crisis support that they actually need, that's going to be person-centred and helpful for them. Next slide, please. Generic services, so the idea that, one size fits all, despite the wellbeing agenda and Section 1 of the Care Act, and the legal duty to really look at people's wellbeing needs and offer person-centred, strength-based approaches, still the design of services is quite generic. I think you could look more closely at what the needs are. And services, they're not responsive to people's needs in the way they might prefer. And maybe we're not trying to understand the perspective of the person who may have mental health problems. Perhaps people seek help from their church or community first, then from their GP or from us. Next slide, please. And then just a participant quote about inpatient care, which we're finding is one of the major issues really that's coming through in this study in terms of a lack of appropriate inpatient care. So finding out from the people at the time that they're leaving inpatient care about how it is, what it's actually like to come onto the ward area, how do people treat you and respect you and your preferences? Are those questions being asked when the person is detained on the ward or not? It's an open question that you might want to give some thought to. Next slide, please. And then moving on now to training and professional reflection and the importance of that. I think a lot needs to happen within services and training, and space for professionals to reflect on these issues. I think there's a lot around thinking about how we communicate detention to people as well. Sometimes as people supporting people with mental health difficulties, we can look at it from the perspective of, well, it's for their own safety and for the trust that people are trying to have someone's best interests at heart. But if you've experienced trauma, then you're detained. That is re-traumatizing in itself. So really centralising how trauma impacts on the person on that pathway, I think, is going to be key to moving forward and thinking about suitable interventions that might be piloted as part of this research study. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to end on recommendations for AMP practice. So these are open-ended, reflective questions that you're probably already considering, but if you're not, maybe you want to give them some thought and maybe discuss them in your forums. So considering how mental health act assessments give voice to the experiences of institutional racism that Black and African Caribbean men experience within mental health services, and especially with the police, both historically and in the present day. Carefully considering the unnecessary use of police power. So there's a few examples actually from the interviews of high numbers of police officers arriving at a person's home where the AMP themselves thought that 2 officers would be proportionate and an appropriate response. But the question really is, do you escalate disproportionate responses? And is that disproportionate response by the police acted upon both within the police themselves, and is it acted on within broader mental health service design and delivery? How do you escalate where you found that, and is support offered really to the person that has been on the receiving end of that, to ask them what their experiences of it were, or is it just a cycle that's repeated again and again and again? And then thinking about community inreach and working with faith groups, so building bridges and regaining the trust of Black communities, which of course was a wider issue that was picked up in the Casey report. Do you really know what the alternatives to admission are, and how well do you know communities and their assets? And is care coordination and are mental health act assessments culturally sensitive from the point of view of Black and African Caribbean men? And if you think they are, how do you know they are? And if they're not, what needs to change? And then using supervision as a space for critical reflection, but also importantly as a space for action. And then also, extremely importantly, advocating for Black and African Caribbean men where you see examples of injustice. So this might be raising it through your various management structures, or reporting it as an untoward incident, or through the AMP forums and the AMP Leads network. So just some ideas really for reflection on your own practice, and maybe you've got some thoughts about how you work within services, and maybe how some of those services could be redesigned to be more culturally appropriate for the people that you're working with, and specifically in the context of anti-racist AMP practice. Okay, final slide. So thank you, everyone. I look forward to any questions that you might have. And then
thank you ever so much. Thank you, Caroline. Contact details on the slide, and Alina's there. That's really, really provocative set of recommendations or reflections. I think you described them at the end there, and absolutely helpful for AMPs and AMP services to take away, particularly in terms of understanding how to understand what good looks like. So in terms of questions, we'll come back to those later, if I may. So thanks ever so much, Caroline. If I can now turn to our colleagues, Jacqui, Dyer and Husnara. Excellent, we've got the slide on. So Jacqui, Husnara, working within and alongside our colleagues from NHSE. I've introduced you with your various titles and interests and so on and achievements. So Jacqui, can I hand over to you?
Yes, and good morning, everybody.
Thank you.
You can see that our focus is on the patient and carer Race Equality Framework, which was a recommendation from the Mental Health Act review that I was a participant in, and have been able to lead the development of this framework via NHS England. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me. So I'm a lived expert by experience, and grew up with my mother in and out of hospital, receiving electrical ECT treatment. I'm sure you all know what that is. And subsequently, I've got 3 siblings with severe mental health challenges, diagnoses, and so I've been a carer for over 3.5 decades. Unfortunately, the mental health system has failed my family, and the worst outcome is that 2 of my siblings have passed away, one at the age of 41 and one at the age of 54, the most recent being 6 days after the death of George Floyd. And I have a sister who still lives with mental health challenges, who I fret every day as regards whether or not she too is going to die young, in the absence of mental health services that really effectively meet her whole person needs in the way that has been described thus far by the previous presenters. And it was the experience of the services that led to my being involved in this has got to change, because if I am experiencing this in relation to my siblings, and I'm an advocate and actually working as an advocate for people with mental health challenges, then what are families and individuals experiencing when they are at their most vulnerable is really actually quite shocking. And I wanted to be able to be involved in helping to transform mental health service provision, and essentially for racialized communities, which has just been outlined, have quite significantly a differential experience. Next slide, please. So the Patient and Carer Race Equality Framework actually came about from a recommendation that I put into the CRISP Commission. And at that point, it was named the Patient and Carer Race Equality Standard. And the reason why it's named that way is because I wanted to make sure that the voice of lived experience was elevated in ensuring and contributing to service improvements. If you go to a shop and you buy some goods as a consumer, if those goods are not working, you bring it back, you get a refund, or you take it back and you buy something else. In mental health service provision, if mental health services are not working for you, there's no recourse to justice, it seems, thus far. And there's no recognition of the voice of the recipients of care being the most important voice to help shape what services need to be available to respond to their identified needs, rather than an imposition from services that don't share the lived experience of structural discrimination, structural inequalities, structural racism, and indeed the lived experience of all of that intersectionally from a racialized perspective. So we've taken forward the development of the PCREF in a co-productive way with lived experience, mental health professionals, mental health policy leads, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, as well as the CQC, all helping to co-produce a very rigorous framework. And it is an anti-racism framework. That is what it is. In other words, it is a race equity accountability framework that makes very transparent everything that is done in order to improve the racialized experience of access, experience, and outcomes of service provision, of mental health service provision. And that includes all services along the pathway. So that's inpatient services, perinatal mental health services, psychological therapies, secure services, community mental health services, every single service related to attending to the needs of people when they are vulnerable in terms of their mental health. And how do we ensure that we are they're getting the best possible experience and not one which is discriminatory and infused with racism. So we've worked in terms of developing the framework, the anti-racism framework, with 6 pilot sites, 4 pilot sites rather, and some early adopter sites. When I say sites, I mean mental health trust provision. These slides are going to be distributed, so I'm not going to go through every single slide. And what we've made sure is that not only are people with lived experience, i.e. patients, carers, and communities, because we also have to remember that patients and carers live within the context of families and communities and networks. And so the framework, the anti-racism framework, is one which is really inclusive of the lived experience of racism. And so their feedback in terms of whether or not service improvements are actually being made is actually part of the assessment of whether or not a trust is progressing in implementing the PCREF. So, for example, self-assessment, of which Husnara will talk a little bit about, is a critical part. An inclusive self-assessment is a critical part of the implementation and the rollout of the PCREF. So, next slide, please. I wonder if you could speak now, Husnara, to the other components.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. It is still morning, yes. My name's Husnara Malik. I work at NHS England as part of the National Mental Health Team. I'm Programme Lead for the Advanced Mental Health Qualities, and particularly delivering the patient carers quality framework supporting Dr. Jacqui Dyer. On your screen here, what you have is a visual of the PCREF. And what I should add is it's a significant milestone we've reached at this very stage. We are due to publish the Patient Care Race Quality Framework, which is fantastic. And so we're hoping to publish that week commencing the 23rd of October, which is next week. Alongside, we have our national PCREF webinar on the 3rd of November. So if you haven't received the invite, we'll share it with our colleagues who are facilitating this event. And I'm sure they'll share that out with you, but certainly I encourage you to come along. So what is the PCREF? Jacqui has obviously described the evolution of the PCREF and the importance of why a PCREF is absolutely needed. PCREF very simply is in 3 components or 3 parts. And here on the screen you see you've got part 1, which very much focuses on leadership and governance. And there are a number of key aspects of what we mean by leadership and governance that is underpinned for trusts to carry out and undertake the work in this particular area. One being that it is underpinned by legislative and statutory duties. And these are legislative acts and statutory duties that we all are very well aware of. Clearly, as AMHP, you're very well aware of that you carry out in your day-to-day job in supporting patient care. So these are around, of course, the Human Rights Act, the Mental Health Act, the Use of Force Act, the Equality Act, the Health and Social Care Act in its various forms that's come out over the years, including, more recently around ICS, the Carers, the Care Act, the Carers Act. I'm not going to go through all of the 12, but it's very much written quite clearly in the PCREF framework when you do manage to have a look at the official version when it comes out. Those acts clearly is highlighting, one, of course, it is your obligation as a statutory body to fulfil, but we know that's not been happening over the years, and we've heard obviously from from our guest speakers today in regards to the picture of what's been happening and that it continues to happen and why the PCREF is so significant in relation to this. What we've done in the PCREF is identify specific metrics, PCREF metrics that is underpinned by each one of those acts. So whether that be around looking at your Mental Health Act data, you know, all the Mental Health Act sections, Section 2, 3, 135, 136, and so on, where that is, of course, reported up and down the country by trusts, by mental health service providers. And we know, of course, that the disproportionate level of rates when we look at racialised communities, particularly Black African and Black Caribbean. But what we know, what's been happening historically, is no trusts have been held accountable. And of course, the PCREF as an anti-racism framework is an accountability framework. So when we talk about leadership and governance, it's very much about sitting at that level for them to be held accountable, to make sure that they're looking at those particular metrics and really about understanding why there needs to be, of course, improvements, why there hasn't been improvements, and making sure that they're doing that collaboratively with racialized representatives that should be sat at that board level, and making sure that trusts are transparent, because we're no longer in the situation of closed culture, which is what's been happening. And so that's what makes this unique in terms of what we have set out in the PCREF and what we've seen quite well, and you'll see in the rest of the slide decks some really great examples of the 10 pilot trusts that we've been working with, and so many other trusts who have just started their journey, who have not joined nationally, but doing, of course, a lot of work locally in terms of how they've really shifted their governance and their leadership, having a PCREF exec lead, for example, making sure that there are representatives from faith-led, voluntary sector, ethnic-led organisations, along with racialised experts by experience, patient and carers, who are really at the decision-making and looking at some of these critical areas of data that's so important, and then coming up with a collaborative co-developed plan around how the trust are going to look to improve. That then, of course, feeds into what we call part 2 of the PCREF, which is the national organisational competencies. These have been co-developed over the years with our pilot trusts, and what we landed with is with 6 national organisational competencies. So these are around cultural awareness, staff knowledge and awareness, workforce, partnership, co-learning, co-production. These are the 6 that we've identified through, of course, the work with patient carers, voluntary sector organisations via the pilot trusts of what mattered most to them. But what we have also encouraged trusts, and what they have done, the trusts that have been working with us, is, of course, identified local organisational competencies on top of the 6 that trusts are required to look at. Now, what we always say that part 2 is your engine for the PCREF, right? If you get part 2 right, then you'll start to see significant improvements on the data in part 1, and particularly around patient care experience in part 3. So this is where all the key activities take place in part 2 around working with your racialised communities, looking at those organisational competencies. What we've done in the framework, we've come up with a scale of improvement where it talks about an example around what does a developing trust look like around a cultural awareness competency, what does a good trust look like around each one of those competencies, and what does outstanding trust look like for each one of those competencies. Alongside this is what we've developed is a self-assessment checklist as a starting point and as a base point for trust to be able to use as a guideline to understand actually what they should be starting off looking at in terms of understanding when we talk about cultural awareness, what does good look like from a racialized perspective. So there's a lot of work that needs to be going into part 2 to ensure that you've really fully transformed your services. And we're talking about service transformation here, not just at an organisation leadership level. This is really about making significant changes. And you'll know that. Go ahead, Jacqui.
So it's service transformation and service innovation. So if we think about the insights that have been gathered already in the previous sort of like contributions to this this session, then actually what are the interventions or the new services that are required so much earlier in the pathway before people actually get into crisis, and what are the insights that can be shared from the AMP professionals that influence service improvements and service innovation. So actually the AMP's role in terms of providing feedback to support the organizational competencies in application to service innovation and improvement is really quite critical. And I believe that some of the work that in terms of the data around referrals is actually in terms of the demographics of referrals through to mental health services that the AMPs provide is also really critical information. And I believe Jason's working on that source of data that we can incorporate then into part one. So essentially what I'm saying is that there's a real leadership activist roles for AMP professionals to contribute to this anti-racism framework by providing that information from their experience, from their part of the system to support the lived experience, and in fact their lived experience, to help with the service improvements and the service innovation along the mental health pathways. I think that's really critical to get across here, that there's an activist role for AMPs to be more visible and present, particularly as many of them are trained in a more biopsychosocial sort of whole system sort of way of thinking, which is not just located in the medical model, which actually then helps to attend to the whole person and the whole family, and the multiple dimensions that people bring in their humanity to the experience of emotional distress and trauma and so forth. I hope I'm making sense here as to the value that the contribution of this profession that is really not as visible as it needs to be in the scheme of things.
Yeah, totally, Jacqui. This framework is not just an NHS framework. It's absolutely for AMPs to be cited on and to influence. So we're really glad that we're here having this conversation. If I just finish off and round off with part three.
Just say we've just got a couple of minutes. Husnara, if that's
fine,
okay.
That's fine. I'm not going to go through the other slides because I've talked about them, to be honest, because I think this visual gives a real high level of what we've just said, which covers in the other slides. And part three is what we call the heart of the PCREF, which is really about the patient carers feedback. And there's two areas really that we're looking at, is looking at from a outcomes perspective and an experience perspective. And there's tons of work that's been done and that we know exists in terms of lots of outcome tools, patient experience tools. But what we do know from the work that we've done so far is that none of those pertain to racialized communities in terms of asking the right questions from a race perspective. So there's a bit of work that we're doing around looking at that, but also there's a lot of work being done around improving the quality of the data, particularly around protected characteristics and specifically on race and ethnicity. And then the other part is one of our ambitions that we are looking to work towards is developing a digital tool. And that's really about making sure that we can have a feedback in real time. So we often use the phrase TripAdvisor, for example. We don't know what the satisfaction levels are immediately anyway from patients and carers. And what we're trying to achieve here, and we know it's been done before, is be able to look at feedback in real time, and so that could really address some of those issues that come in an iterative way rather than waiting months on end to know what's been happening. So that in a nutshell is what we're saying is PCREF in those three parts. The other slides I'm not going to go into detail, but hopefully we'll share these slide decks where it describes a bit more around part one on the metrics in terms of what we've been measuring or what we're asking the trust to measure. Part two, the other slide, very much describes what we've described around the improvement framework and some examples around improvement actions that trusts are required to measure. And then the other slide, part three, is around the numerous outcomes and experience tools that we know exist that our trusts are working on. And finally, the last two slides very quickly. I'm not going to go through this, but what we will be doing is publishing alongside the framework. Next week, we'll be publishing a supplementary document, which is all the good practice examples that our trusts and on how our trusts have embedded the PQF for each of those parts. And there's some examples here. There's key questions here that we've put, which Jacqui's already addressed, to say what help would AMP professionals need to help embed the PQF1, and how can you get more involved in shaping your local PQF, which Jacqui's already alluded to. And then the last slide deck, very quickly, in terms of our ambitions going forward around next steps post implementation. We want to, of course, we talked about the PQF on a systematic level, so very much the focus is around working with our ICSs and ICBs and looking at how we can embed the PQF on a system level. We've had quite a few ICSs approach us already, and that also includes the fundamental big kind of elephant in the room is how health inequalities, mental health inequalities funding is allocated across ICSs, which is forever more complicated area, but one that we're determined to look into, and particularly from a race perspective, what does that mean? How is that being allocated and decisions being made? We know we need to get more work done in terms of strengthening our understanding of carers' role, particularly from racialised carers, because obviously it's about patient and carers on this framework. We are also looking at developing a PQF dashboard nationally, and this is to be made accessible for patient carers and communities, not just the professionals. And this is really about breaking it down on regional, local, and national level. So certainly watch the space for that. And what else is on my screen? And we hope once we've launched, we'll be looking at carrying out an independent evaluation of the PQF. I'm going to stop there. Jacqui, is there any other final words you want to add?
Only to say in terms of the dashboard, this is really quite an exciting part of what it is that we're doing, because this is about what race equity accountability looks like, and we're moving away from closed culture. So as an anti-racism framework, all of the evidence of how progress is being made to implement this anti-racism framework that is improving access, experience and outcomes for racialized communities across all mental health service provision across the pathway. The dashboard will be available from a mental health trust level, mental health service provision level, at an ICS level, at a regional level and at a national level, and will be accessible for all communities to be able to see transparently. So data from part 1 will be there. Part 2, all the activities that are being conducted in order to help to change the trajectory of part 1, and the data within part 3. So this is really quite exciting, because then it enables patients, carers and communities and the workforce, wherever they're located, to be participant actively in engagement in helping this transformation agenda for improved outcomes for our communities when they're at their most vulnerable. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have to say that over the last couple of years of working in this post, you guys have become like new best friends and allies with this mission. And to see the PQF go from strength to strength, it's really helpful to call it what it is, the anti-racism framework, because the PQF is almost something you want to kind of get off the pharmacy shelf or something. The PQF, the anti-racism framework, is something that all AMPs need to know about, and we would really welcome, for all of the reasons that you've heard, getting behind it and understanding what you need to use from it and to be able to accelerate it in your local systems. We will have opportunity for more questions, but you will also see the slides. You will be able to see in the chat there is some sort of a something that's kicking off in terms of kicking off a request for slides. So can I just reiterate the fact that if you've signed up to this BASW webinar, you will automatically receive access to the slides. If you manage to get the access to the webinar today from somebody sending you a sneaky link, then that's why we need to understand who you are in terms of your email contact details, etc. So please don't feel obliged to provide your email address in the chat if you've signed up and registered through the BASW portal. Thanks ever so much again, Jacqui. Thanks ever so much again, Husnara. Look forward to continuing to working with you. Please stay for questions and chat at the end. But brilliant. Let's hand over now to our next guest speakers who are going to join us in conversation. We have Shantel Thomas and Neil Sanyal, who are professional leads in their respective roles. And I will be economic with my introduction and hand straight over to the pair of you. Can't see Neil yet. He's there somewhere. There, lovely.
He's here somewhere, yeah.
I will switch myself off.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Just thank you to the speakers that have gone before us. Yes, I'm Shantel Thomas, and I'm going to be having a conversation with Neil. But Neil, I'll let you start, and we just go straight into this.
Hi, I can't see myself on the screen really, but never mind. Everyone else can. That's good. Yeah, I guess what Jason's referred to allyship at the beginning of this, and Shantel and I both had a sort of journey towards representing what allyship has been about in the last couple of years. And my personal journey probably started with the event that Colin King had mentioned when he said there was a kind of webinar on Mental Health Act and institutional racism in October 2020. That was a bit of a watershed. So out of that, I'd also then watched Dr. Helen Morgan's incredible presentation. Chantal actually works in the same organisation as her. She did a presentation on whiteness, a problem for our time, which was attended by 1,000 people at once. And she explored the psychological effects of 400 years of British Empire on white people's minds. And she's a psychodynamic psychotherapist. I urge you to look at her YouTube, that presentation on her YouTube. It's pretty amazing, and it certainly was a real revelation to me about the other side of the coin of fighting racism all these years that I have done in my life, and 30 odd years as a social worker and AMP. So I guess the introduction to allyship for everyone is that the lived experience of having racism, having racial abuse, etc., is one thing in terms of needing to get rid of it. But the lived experience of being part of the white British systemic and institutional racist society, which Colin so emphasised in the psychiatry, that bit is also something which needs to be worked on. Over to you, Shantel.
Yeah, no, thank you. And just to add, you touched on Helen Morgan's talk, and I think that was probably the first time, a lot of people would have, if people have watched that, heard, whiteness described in that way, because often when we look at anti-racism, when we think about what that means, we look at blackness as the problem, as though, being black is the issue, and that needs to be curtailed or controlled in some way. But what we understand, and through the work that I do and I've been doing, with BASW, before BASW, after BASW, is around looking, helping people to understand, what this term whiteness means and how it has infiltrated, our systems and our structures, and how, we're not talking about white people, but it's this phenomenon of whiteness that we feel is, the be all and end all, and it's like we're all aspiring to be, so I think it's really important that we understand that. And a lot of the training that I do, because as you mentioned, I work for the Tavistock. I'm a social worker by background, educator, and also doing my research around anti-racist leadership, and a lot of the work that I facilitate and the training that I do is to help people to reconnect with that and to really understand what anti-racism means for them. I think Jacqui really put it really well in terms of the social worker as the activist, and reminding us of our role in that, particularly as the AMP. You're not just a passive participant in this system. You have a role to play in challenging, and I think it's important that we remember that. And to do that, we have to understand our own biases, understand where we're coming from, understand how we've been socialized, in order that we can challenge, in order that we can speak up.
And I've developed this allyship development training, as has Chantal. Mine's been mainly for AMPs, so that's why I think Jason would wanted me to talk about this today. And I talk about the sort of books that people can read, and this has been a national phenomenon, really. Our Carla's book, Natives, Reniero Lodge's book, Why I've Stopped Talking to White People About Racism. Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy. They are probably the big texts I would say that AMPs out there need to be looking at if they haven't already. And so my presentations talk about white fragility, kind of ignorance, colour blindness, those sorts of aspects of what's going on in people's minds and lives, and how that kind of governs how they see the world, really. And again, linking in with Colin's amazing, very shocking and disturbing starting talk, the whole business of what BME AMPs like me, how we cope with that, from turning up to mental health act assessments, and having in my area, the areas that I have practiced since I left Liverpool in 1996 have been predominantly white British areas with a few kind of BME populations around. So the reactions that the doctors have had to South Asian doctors, for example, from patients, families, this has come up recently in discussions with EMAD's BME AMP forum. So there are aspects of all this which cover the whole territory, and white British AMPs, when they're assessing someone in central London with 6 police officers present, aren't going in there with some kind of neutral backdrop. They're arriving with all the things that you've heard today, all the backdrop. And the idea that Shantel and I have both got is to train people into thinking about all that goes into it before they get there. Over to you, Shantel.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really important, because yes, we're here about looking at systems and structures, because of course that's where the majority of the power is, and that's where the forces are that we are trying to change. But what we need to remember is that people make up these systems and these structures, and people are made up of their own intrinsic values, ethics, and so the way they've been socialized. So it's really, really important, as you mentioned, a lot of those resources, that we start to look at self. We have to really shine that light on ourselves, internally. It isn't just for Black people to be standing up and fighting the cause. It's everybody's responsibility, just like safeguarding is. As I said, bringing the social worker out, bringing the personal out as well. This isn't just a job, a role, a profession. This is my living experience, day in, day out. Nobody sees fancy titles when I step into a room. What they're going to see first is a Black woman and judge me on that. So that's the kind of energy that I kind of bring when I bring to any kind of facilitation. I don't like to call it training, because I think it's important that we allow people to that space to really do
more
that.
like sharing, isn't it, Shantel? More like sharing.
Yeah, it is. And it's reminding people that it's okay to feel uncomfortable. It's right. If you're sitting there feeling uncomfortable, then you're doing the work correctly. But you have to do something. You can't just sit back and expect just to read the PCREF or do one step in it and then you're going to be okay. You have to do that work, and that work is tough.
I mean, at this point, I wanted to say some of the people who've really supported me, prompted my kind of presentation to be able to be shown, enabled all sorts of stuff to happen. And Robert Lewis and Christina Cheney, the co-chairs of the National AMP Leads Forum network, which I was co-opted on about 18 months ago. They have been so incredibly supportive and opened doors for me. And it was so crucial. Gillian Robinson, who's just literally flown back to Australia after 30 years working here.
She worked with us at the trust as well.
Yes, Shantel knows her. She has been an inspiration to so many people. And she was the one who first acknowledged when I put it out there about allyship. She was the one who first sent it all out. She was immediately the strong supporter, and she has been all the way through my journey. And I just want to also mention, when I do my talks, I share good practice around the country, and there's 3 kind of centres that I've found. One is Shropshire County Anti-Racist Forum. They're doing an incredible job of anti-racist practice, involving everyone, Black, white, whichever creed and ethnicity you are. Everyone works together on that, and there's a BME forum as a safe space within it. And what they're achieving in a very white Highland, very racist county. I tell people all the time, I fly the flag for them. Millie Kerr, who Shantel also knows in Brighton. Millie was anti-racist lead practitioner. She's now kind of advisor to near the board level. And in 3
she's
years,
strategic lead now. She's strategic.
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
she has transformed Brighton and Hove children and families through an allyship model. She's been incredible to have a weekly webinar for white British social workers to help them in a safe space explore what's in their heads. She's gone through, why young black and minority ethnic teenagers are in gangs, what happens with black fathers who are not there, county lines, and she gets through their heads in terms of what they've absorbed from all this stuff and turns it around.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, we've got to remember the emotional impact of that, when we're doing this work, particularly when this is our living experience, and we're in these spaces trying to facilitate these conversations. It's important that we understand and we recognise the impact it does have on us as practitioners, professionals, leaders, whatever, term we want to be using, and just to be mindful of that. And that's when we say we're, allyship, we're coalition, we're us working together, for the greater cause, is absolutely essential, because what often happens is it's left to those of us who, deal with racism on a daily basis to, fly the flag, and, that's what we need to be moving away from.
Yeah,
and that's,
exactly.
This is all, this is all about, and all the different structures that we have.
Sorry to interrupt. Emad, would you mind just turning your camera off? Sorry, just don't want to be a distraction. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was nice to have him.
I thought that was our time up. I thought he was reminding us. Go ahead, Neil.
Anyway, yeah. So I've done some face-to-face stuff, which, considering the backdrop of COVID, and this was the only communication we had for anything, it was quite brilliant to go to the Yorkshire AMP conference back in April and kind of meet some of these people who would, work a long way away from me. And so I've had invites up to York recently from Hannah Vachikowskis. So, I've been to West Berkshire, all parts of England, really.
Getting around it, aren't you?
Yeah, I am, yeah. And I'm not trying to big myself up. It's about illustrating the point that people around the country are really interested in this allyship model. It's early days for people to be aware of it. But I think it's really, really important. So just back to the National AMP Leads Steering Group, we've created a working group to work on anti-racist practice for everyone. Because one of the things returning to some of the theme of this, there's something which has been pointed out. Robert was the one who pointed out to me when he was doing some of the preparation work in Devon with white British managers. One of them said to him, "Won't I be seen as a white saviour if I kind of intervene and kind of champion this?" And that's a genuine concern for a lot of white British people. And I think that a fair few white British people would have been doing more by now if they hadn't been reticent and worried about how that would seem if they were kind of trying to lead this. And I think that the model I'm trying to work on is joint leadership.
That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah. I mean, Matt Simpson, who runs the Bournemouth AMP course, and we're doing the Race Equality Day for the AMP trainees in January. And he agreed to do it joint with me. And Hannah's asked if that could happen when I come up to York. And I think that's the model. It's about showing just the equally important thing about lived experience on the one hand from me, from all my life and all my work, and from the white British professional there who's basically saying this counts, I'm involved in this, and you ought to be as well. I just think that's a brilliant model, don't you, Shantel?
I do, and that's why I prefer the term coalition, because you're right. Yeah. When you hear the word, the term allyship, saviorism, it is often what comes up, because again, it's usually a white person doing things from their perspective and what they think we need. Yeah. As opposed to asking, or as opposed to coming alongside and listening. We have a voice. We know what we need. We know what needs to happen. We don't need anyone to tell us. But what is happening is obviously the power imbalance, which makes it so. And obviously, as we heard, whiteness is the problem. This term, this structure, this system, is what is causing. What Colin so powerfully described at the beginning. I know the feedback was a bit muffly, but it was very clear to me what he was saying. I could feel every word from his point of view. And you know, having family members myself who have been through the system, and just listening to that was such a, you know, if that doesn't jerk you into action, then what
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah,
we
you know, just what it is, coalition coming alongside. We don't need anybody to save us on a white horse or what have you. You know, it's about coming alongside and working with us in order to the cause.
And I guess just to link the Colin's talk and this whole subject, for white British amps out there, and I've had discussions with various people that I've mentioned in this discussion about when you're a white British amp and you're there in a kind of metropolitan area, you're faced with a CTO from a psychiatrist who, if you lose Colin's analysis, really is the agent of total social control over that person. You have actually got the choice to say no. You don't have to agree with CTOs. And I think it's case by case. But I think for white British amps to contemplate that can be quite disturbing, really, when they start to see the power of it and the 11 times over proportion of CTOs with Black and African Caribbean and BME populations compared to white British. It's not a simplistic thing. I'm not trying to say it's simplistic. I think the starting point is, do I have to agree to this? And all the other stuff we've talked about feeds into it. I don't know what you think, Shantel.
Yeah, just going to end just to say that everybody needs to be 1% braver every day. Everybody needs to step forward and to challenge. If you see something that doesn't feel right and it doesn't look right, you know, all what you're learning today and what you will learn on your anti-racism journey, one needs to challenge. One needs to use our voice. You know, use responsibility as a social worker, as an AMP, you know, in that profession, and to really speak up. And that's where I will leave it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil. Take care.
No, thank you both. Thank you. It's really great to have a different format. That kind of conversational is so much kind of not more engaging, but more engaging. It's really it's a really good mix. And the AMP world's a small world, so it's really relevant and helpful for you to be but to be just talking about the network. And then to bring, you know, that concept of the coalition into play is really meaningful. I'm sure we'll have some discussion in the Q&A about looking at strategies and that kind of uncomfortableness, particularly for your white British AMP, etc. And the white saviour piece. It's really resonated, white British. Thank you both very much. Thank you. So just to bring us to towards the end of the speaker set, I'd like to reintroduce Dr. Colin King. Colin, just for the second half of your slides, could I ask for you to bring in your next set of perspectives? Hopefully we've moved away from the tech issues, and if I can hand over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay this time?
Yeah, I can hear you. Still got that reverb going on in the background a little bit.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds a lot better.
Okay, I'm going to be quick so you can have some questions.
Well, we're fine for time. We're okay for time. I think people will really appreciate the value. There is still that little bit of reverb, so if you can speak loudly, and forgive me if I interrupt if it gets tricky.
So I'm going to speak loudly. This is part 3 of my presentation because I wanted to end up what is a lived experience anti-racist perspective that has parity with other professionals. I was with Black Fibers was a very positive but very emotionally damaging experiences to see people being exploited and demonized on wards. So what we did, we applied for some money, so a mental health improvement research to look at what is the experience of detention, what needs to change. I'm delighted that this was led by lived experience Black researchers. The picture you will see is a very painful picture because the people have been repetitively admitted under hospital. One person here has been admitted 28 times and he's 48 years of age, overly medicated. Somebody used the term, I'm just another nigger on the ward. Because I want to begin to look at somebody who's been a painful contribution to our lives as Black people, Sir Simon Wesley, and his contribution to racism as the antidote that we need to then begin to challenge. So I want to begin in the next slide, look at some challenges for the AMPs and some questions. So here's a question of people on the ward at Lambeth Hospital that's due to be closed this year. Most of these people cannot get off the ward because of 13 years of austerity, lack of housing and social care. They are institutionalized and illegally placed on mental health units and repetitively readmitted to the wards they should not be on. So we want to begin to say, what does the lived experience model look like to the AMP? Who should we talk to? What are the answers? We talked to 50 black people, service users. I don't like the word service users, I don't like the word patients, and I don't like the word lived experience. We talked to doctors, we talked to AMPs, but we're really focused on what changes that needs to happen in terms of the AMP's activism to enable people to address the overrepresentation from section 1, 2, right through to section 8. We're really kind of focused on that. But also, how do we have what we call a lived experience epistemological framework? That is a knowledge that's essential to the AMPs in their coalition with the police in terms of how they make assessment of race equality and the needs of mental health. If we can just go to the next slide. So the questions for the day were these for me. What are the current challenges for AMP in doing your work? And this is something that comes out in the research done by Abbott in 2021. Can the lived experience have a central position in the models of training and education, even in the licensing of AMPs? But also, the AMPs do not operate in the vacuum. What are the challenges for AMPs when they are working alongside consultant psychiatrists who might have the powerful diagnostic lens, police who have the coercive lens, in making new, effective, joint legal accountability models? And lastly, how do we challenge the mental health white paper to stop the numbers of racialized? Now, I'm going to use the word racialized because it comes from a person by the name of Stephen Small, 1984, and the overrepresentation. Why do we need mental health systems? What is their role? And how do AMPs begin to change? Well, Jacqui will talk about that activism and activate on behalf of who. So I'm going to begin to address some of the challenges that we discussed and maybe some solutions that are made by this lived experience research group about changes to the AMP's role and what we need to look like in mental health in the next 5 or 10 years. So if we just go to the next slide. One of the things they said is that we need an Afrocentric theoretical approach to AMPs that actually works across all races that can be adopted. Fannon's notion of the mask should be used to understand the values that AMPs bring to the role, the mask AMP. What is beneath the values and the prejudices that activate the way they actually use the Mental Health Act? They need to look at Garvey's self-determination. How do we give lived experiences respect to models and theories that are essential to the way they actually assess mental health, and begin to challenge something called schizophrenia? Everybody talks about a Eurocentric approach. Eurocentric is a very, very complex thing that we need to break down to. And I'm really pleased that the last speaker talked about whiteness, because I run a group called the Whiteness and Race Equality Group. But we need to talk about the role of women. We need to talk about the experiences and the feminist approaches that emerged from writers such as Hook and Davis that begin to give us a different paradigm to the diversity of these experiences. They are not homogeneous, they're not unified. I've written so many articles for the Lancet Psychiatry on what I call co-production. And I'm say co-production cannot operate unless there's equality of parity and power, which is outlined in the Mental Health Use of Forces Act. But lots of us have talked about dashboards, and we've got to be really careful about collecting data, interpreting data, and using it to reinforce the stereotypes that continue to demonize the Black community. That's why I'm advocating for a lived experience, interpreting the data. And lastly, we need to get more people from lived experience writing, contributing towards new knowledge, information, and formation that actually informs the way we monitor people's practices, how we license the AMPs, how we actually see what is competent that must be based upon the lived experience feedback. And then I'm advocating for lived experience pathways and practitioners that work alongside AMPs at crucial moments of their interventions and assessments. I'm going to go into that in the next slide about how can we activate that change. So this is the response to the legislation. how the AMP role could change and what the accountability framework would say. When we talked about people, they thought the Mental Health Act is a decriminalisation, and we should decriminalise the Mental Health Act. And they wanted an abolition of Section 1. They wanted to get rid of the historical definition of the disease of the mind that's permutated from the 59 Act, the 83 Act, and there's racialized perceptions which people have talked about, this notion of whiteness. But then how do we get AMPs to challenge culturally inappropriate assessments? And we're advocating that lived experience should look at section papers, should look at the competencies of how people are sectioning people, and actually decide if the process is equitable and right and accountable. And that lived experience should be a check on the police, psychiatrists, and AMPs, who should be sitting with the administrators who actually take the papers in, look at the papers and say, is this a legitimate process of assessment? Have they really considered every option? And let's move away from the least restrictive for Black people and look at the most beneficial. They advocated for removal of the powers of the 136. Police should never be given a power that they're never trained to understand. They're perpetuating the stereotype that are actually activated from the Children's Act into the Criminal Justice Act, into Youth Act and camps. So they're actually looking at how do we liaise with lived experience assessors. We're also looking at the removal of 136 suites and replacing them with lived experience place to safety hubs, which means we use the long-term plan to invest in more community mental health resources that are therapeutically geared towards the Black experiences. We have experienced the complete erosion of the Black experience and Black services, and there is a strong correlation about why AMPs are forced to look at the least restrictive as the hospital. So we want an integrated lived experience model in terms of 136 assessments. We want to begin to look at changes in the principles of the Act towards most beneficial liberation. And we are very concerned about the safety and rights of people in this recommendation that we move from health and safety to the notion of significant harm, which is actually replicated in the Children's Act and has led to the greatest overrepresentation of Black children who move from the Children's Act to the Criminal Justice Act to the Mental Health Act. So we want models that focus on cultural strength models of assessments of Black families. And this means challenging Eurocentric biases as a prominent feature discussed throughout many of the presentations again. We also, going back to Christopher Clunas, we want lived experience cultural risk models that are devised by people with lived experiences that are activated by approved mental health practitioners. Going into a bit more detail, people just felt, sorry, I'm nearly finished. People just felt that Section 2, the whole discussion today is really concerning because we focus on services and we look at needs. And I think we AMPs have moved away from actually predetermining the service. We're actually looking at what are the cultural needs that inform the service that we actually need. And also we need culturally relevant interventions that are determined by lived experiences. Even the method, the quality, the type, the relationship, the assessments, but more concerningly, the collaboration with the lived experiences. And this may mean challenging our Eurocentric models of treatment. Care and treatment are Eurocentric models. Medication, misdiagnosis are really concerning things. Having worked for Black Fives and being a member and previous member of the culturally appropriate peer support, peer advocacy should be at the point of the assessment, not when people are being assessed in place in hospital. This is the real opportunity for lived experience advocates to challenge in joint collaboration AMPs in terms of how people are being assessed, why they're being assessed, and why is it people are looking for beds first rather than doing the assessment? Why they talk about being sectioned rather than being assessed. It's a really concerning dialogue that needs to be challenged. And so what we're asking for is a lived experience treatment guidance, that we determine what is treatment, what is care, and also how one relates to the other without this overt focus on the biomedical treatment approach to the lived experience that AMPs have to actually deal with. Lastly, as I actually advocate, I wrote several papers for Lancet, and the big feeling within the group was they want the abolition of the community treatment orders. This is modern slavery. This is a new type of death mania. There was a possibility to repeal this, and we lost it, and it's now in for the next 10 years. And what we actually want, my last recommendation before I finish this, and I think I'm on time to get you back to your questions, we want, going back to Jacqui, a unification between lived experience and AMPS, meeting together, formulating policies, formulating practices, and anti-racist working. Because that's the only way the AMP can get back to its true position, its true positionality, what it is. There's an advocate. Everybody who works in mental health is an advocate. And the AMP has the most politicized positioning to actually politicize the lived experience. So we want, throughout all these networks set up by AMP, there should be a centralized position for lived experience guidance and panels that informs the work we actually do. Before I finish, I just want to advertise something that's really important about how we need to get back to the political, the social and economic. My last slide. This Saturday on the 28th, friends and families who meet every year for people who have died in state custody. These are people from Rocky Bennett, from Sean Riggs, to numbers of people who have died meet. We like the AMPs to join us in actually showing parliaments and politics and policy makers that we are unified in actually bringing together a joint, creative, politicized, anti-racist approach to the work. And this is something we should be doing together. Thank you.
Colin, this is where I really regret we're on a screen, because I think you'd hear the room be exploding in applause now. So thank you ever so much, and all of our speakers, for all of your contributions. You just made the subject matter and the title of the webinar it just even more real, and incredibly grateful for the messages that you've woven through both of the contributions that you made to set the tone at the beginning and now in the session before we move on to questions and answers. So thank you ever so much. And I really kind of take notice to everybody in mental health being an advocate, but particularly in respect to the AMP role, taking us back to the place where we need to be able to understand our position, particularly in terms of taking an anti-racist perspective. So thanks for taking the slides down, Beth. Thanks to all of our speakers. We haven't been inundated with questions, I have to say, but that's okay. I think we've probably got a lot to reflect and digest. I've got a set of 2 or 3 questions that I'd like to put to our speakers. If our speakers are able to turn their cameras on, and then colleagues should be able to see where we all are. We've got until 11:30 or so, and one question that I wanted to start with, if you bear with me, I'm not sure who it's from, it's been forwarded through to me, but somebody has asked, I feel that AMPs and social workers from BAME communities are so oppressed from covert institutional racism. How are they able to sufficiently advocate for their service users? Sometimes they're in the same boat. How to discover and step into and own personal power to be able to support others. And I wondered, Emad, whether or not you'd be able to come in on that one. So in terms of AMPs working from racialised communities themselves, how they're able to address the challenges that we've heard about today.
Hi. Just wanted to start by thanking all the speakers and for excellent sharing, Jason. So this is a fantastic question. Difficult to really have a comprehensive solution to. Yet, in the DME or the LAC AMP forum that we have, these issues are raised and you feel powerless yourself. and you feel you've been discriminating, how you're going to be empowered. It is challenging, and this is why we need allies. We need a support network. I mean, the BME, the national BME AMP forum is increasingly becoming popular, where AMPs from Black communities, or racialized communities attend, share their views in a comfortable and environment where they feel they're being supported and being understood. It's challenging, and what is even more challenging in relation to the anti-racist practices, racism changes so fast, month by month, and we need to be aware of the social, economic, the political situation. What we have today is very much anti-Semitic, Islamic sort of, feeling going around, and we have to be aware of, and this is where management in health and social care need to be always on board in supporting frontline practitioners, being aware of what's happening to them, or reaching out, because we do value work to communities, and just, I mean, why the PICRAF is so fantastic. It's come from the top of the leadership, the 3 platforms of the PICRAF. So I hope that will make a difference, and working collaboratively. I'm not sure I've answered that question, but it's a really challenging, but actually a question I will actually raise at the next AMP forum. Yes, I will.
Thanks, Emad. Can I come over to Neil?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I've been part of, Emad invited me onto that forum at the beginning, and I think the thing that I would reflect on in this statement you read out from one of the attendees is that the leadership of mental health social care services around the country, and AMP leads in particular, need to acknowledge the difficulties for many BME social workers in getting to be an AMP in the first place. Some have to wait 10 years to get onto the course, and then when they get there, they don't always feel supported. So there are all sorts of complicated reasons for that, not necessarily deliberate, would obviously state, but what comes from that statement is the kind of gist of it is that some of them have commented that they need to be better than the white British colleagues in order to be able to kind of survive and continue to practice and withstand so much in terms of the institutional racist kind of backdrop which they're operating in which they, Social Work England round the corner is all sorts of, fitness to practice stuff. I could go on, but there is in terms of the allyship stuff that I mentioned, there's a major role for senior mental health social care leaders to take on board some of that stuff.
Thank you, Neil.
May I add just on this,
from
another angle?
Yeah,
please do.
Yeah, to just look at it from a different angle here. So I'm aware of a lot of these issues around the racialized experience of AMPs being obviously experiencing in the same way, quite frankly, that which a lot of the citizens are experiencing when they are being detained under the Mental Health Act. So the same systemic racism is in operation in the workforce experience. And what I would suggest is that one way of equipping AMPs who come from racialized groups is to bring to the forefront the PCREF as the accountability framework that evidences what is actually taking place in manifestation of the decision making that the AMP service is making in any one area, in any one borough, in any one geography. Now, with that, it actually is evidence to help to change the conversation, evidence to bring to the conversation that this experience of our citizens is a similar experience that we are experiencing as a workforce. And how are we going to attend to that? So there's something about equipping the workforce with some of the tools to help to facilitate the conversation. And to bear in mind that the PCREF, this anti-racism framework, thanks Jason for reminding us that we need to say what it is actually mandatory. It's not whether or not we want to deliver it, it's actually mandatory across all mental health service provision from April 2024. So all areas are in preparation for that, and it will be inspected by the CQC, by the EHRC, as I said, by those with lived experience. So it is in the interest of the AMP service to be cognizant of this, because the evidence within it is a reflection of the decision making that the AMPs are making. So when we look at the Mental Health Act dashboard, within that, Section 234, 135, 136 are all, Section 20, are all consequences of AMPs decision making that will be transparent to the world. So the management, this is the consequence of your decision. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a different angle to come in to equip, to facilitate a different conversation.
Thank you, Jacqui. So in effect, it's about empowering. It's using the tools available to empower our AMPs on the in their respective roles, etc. And certainly with the experience that they have of actually coming from a racialised community themselves. Thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move to another question. In any particular order, I think we've got one. So knowledge that is disseminated for AMP training in psychiatry does not represent a holistic and true view of what mental health is. As a result, it overemphasises the pharmaceutical interventions. Caroline, I wonder if you might have a view, given your background in AMP training. You're on mute.
Well, when I was a lecturer on the AMP course at University of Manchester, which is going back about 7 or 8, maybe even longer years now, we had a very good curriculum where we did actually have a pharmacist who came to deliver a lecture on, the pharmacological interventions, but also we had many people with lived experience as well, who would talk about that lived experience from different intersectionalities, actually. And we also had carers who would teach on the curriculum. And we had a big emphasis on the social model of disability. And we also included things like thinking about critical race theory, for example, because obviously it's in Manchester, which has got one of the densest populations of ethnic minorities per square metre in England, in actual fact. So I feel I can only talk about the curriculum that I taught on. I can't talk about other curriculums, although I do externally examine for the University of Hertfordshire. And I'll clearly be very interested to see what that curriculum looks like. I'm starting in a couple of weeks doing that external examination, and I will absolutely ensure that, a number of different areas are addressed as part of that curriculum design. But also, it's not just about what's taught, it's also about how that information is then received and developed as part of, embodying a particular approach within AMP practice. We might all listen to something, but are we really understanding what we're listening to? And then are we really acting on what we understand? And are we sense checking that with our other colleagues? And are we sense checking that with the other professionals that we work with? Because, the AMP role is a role of many different hats involving many different professionals. And we need to understand how we're working interprofessionally, how the different concepts of risk are also being brought to bear in terms of operationalising that practice. And I'd be very interested to see how the anti-racist framework actually can be embedded within local authorities. From my point of view, embedding it in health services is fantastic. However, it's only one small part of the cog in a wheel. It needs to be much broader and part of other organisations, I think, to truly be effective.
Thank you, Caroline.
It is. Sorry.
That's good to hear, Jacqui. Thank you.
It's whole system. Because we have to also think about from a commissioning perspective. So it applies to the commissioners as much as it does to mental health provision, whether it be statutory or independent. And we have to think about that interface between community and primary care. So it's whole system, and it applies. So that's really where it's at.
That's fantastic.
So the narrative and the evidence of what each of those stakeholders is doing in terms of implementing this anti-racism framework is an imperative.
Thank you both. Thank you both. The questions are flowing now, so I'm going to jump around and I'm going to suggest, Robert, I wonder if you might be able to help us with this next one that Lynn's posted in the chat. What could be the role of AI in reducing racism in Mental Health Act assessments? Evidence from GPs prescribed treatments for those with anxiety and depression shows significant bias in terms of gender and socioeconomic background, i.e. not following the recommended treatment guidance for treatment. Could AI help in supporting AMP judgments?
Wow. Yeah, Jacqui, please, because I have no starting point for an AI question, I have to be honest.
Well, I think that this is a really interesting area because the AI is going ahead of actually the thinking around this and the whole ethics of using AI, that actually the algorithms are quite often based on biased, which excludes sort of demographic or ethnic categories, for example, and are building algorithms that then as truth leads to more biased assumptions or judgments or whatever kind of like being made. But there is a function for me in how do we use data much more, not necessarily AI, but how do we use data much more intelligently is one of the major components of this anti-racism framework, so that data from a range of sources, so that we have collective insights, collective intelligence, which has collective analysis with all stakeholders, will lead to collective action that has collective impact in the best interests of those people that we're serving. So this ability to actually utilize a range of data sources is something that is really important. But what I would say is that I'm going to ask a question of the CQC in their inspection of this anti-racism framework, PCREF, to pay attention to how AI is being utilized in terms of data, because it's significant. And the data around medication is being a key area of concern for our constituents, and it will be part of the PCREF.
Thank you, Jacqui. Any other colleagues on the panel want to try and come in on this one? No? Okay. I think it's fraught with some ethical concerns, isn't it? And as you say, it's about the triangulation of the data that would inform those artificially compiled responses, etc. And there's something of a concern, isn't there, or something of a disconnect between that and the subjective lived experience that clearly we're benefiting from evolving and devolving as we work through.
Sorry, Jace, I was going to add, I suppose it kind of harks back a little bit, because I can't see what role AI would play in an actual assessment interview. That seems kind of like a long way away as to what would in that exchange, which I think was behind the question, which is why I couldn't think of it. But if we look back to what we had in COVID, where we were having lots of pressure to not even have AMPs and doctors in the same room as the person we were assessing, I think that my fear is that you lose the humanity in all of this. So if you're pursuing some of those kind of sort of techniques or technology to somehow replace a human experience and exchange, I think we haven't got our human experience and exchanges right yet in terms of how we address some of those interfaces with the people that we assess. So the idea that, you know, the computer will only do what we tell it to, which I think is what Jacqui's kind of alluding to there, isn't it? Is that the data will whatever we put in will have the same bias as is currently being experienced.
Given the direction of travel, though, understanding more broadly across society AI, that looks like a real important something that we need to kind of keep a watching brief on, isn't it?
But some people may argue that AI has already been institutionalized in the predetermined way in which you assess people.
Yes, yes, exactly.
That we haven't really changed the assessment processes. We haven't changed the patterns, the scripts, the racialized interventions.
Yeah.
We can humanize it, it becomes objective. Actually, we are activating AI subconsciously in the way we do the work. And what I actually didn't politicize the lived experiences. They have no power in actually being a check and balance. And we're actually reenacting what we did for 100 years with modern eugenics. It's just kind of reenacting itself. So to say that this is often something different, it's actually kind of a mythology that needs to be challenged. There's something radically needs to change about the AMPs doing mental health assessment that we've never really addressed to make it more anti-racist and racialized. And that can only be done by listening to the lived experience voice.
Thanks, Colin. And I think something that's really come to bear and is getting a lot louder across AMP networks and AMP discussions is that of the function of Section 13, the duty around Section 13. And clearly that's where AMPs receive their demand. They need to scrutinise and understand the requests made of them. That's where tackling inequality comes into play. And that's where we're seeing some of these digitalised referral process beginning to take root and take shape. And that's where I think that we need to be placing a lot of attention to understand and make sure that we're as effective as possible in scrutinising the work that's coming down the track, which is asking AMPs to consider their statutory powers. I'm going to come to Colin's question in the chat. AMP work does not function in a vacuum. Colin, I think this is probably one for you. AMP work does not function in a vacuum. The fish rots from the head. Minority community AMPs are oppressed and discriminated against. A particular local authorities refuse to acknowledge Black History Month. Police in South London still insist in sending out 6 police officers to Mental Health Act assessments, quickly to handcuff Black men as common practice when we are bringing these players to the conversation and to account. When are we bringing these players to the conversation and to account for their actions or inaction?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a painful question because the question before about the implications for Black AMPs is about psychological trauma when you have to assess a person that is Black to a system where they're going to suffer racial discrimination is the most painful thing you can actually do. But to recognise that you're in a system where people are inherently being abused on a conscious and a subconscious level, and you have to collude with that to actually not challenge it. You're no longer an activist or an advocate. You're no longer an AMP. You are colluding with institutional racism. And this is a really challenge for AMPs and for white AMPs as well, particularly for white AMPs. If white AMPs are seeing overt forms of racism in practices, and can I say, I've never seen so much racism in mental health practices than I've seen in the last 18 months. And I wonder why we're not disclosing it, why we're not open about it, and the level of abuse that's taking place in relation to the Black body. And I keep using this going back to deplomania. We need a new conversation, we need a new empowerment for AMPs to speak out and to actually take risk and to represent people. Because we will have more people dying in our mental health system, we'll have more people being abused, misdiagnosed, undiagnosed. This is a really, really serious issue. I think measurements and data are really crucial issues to give us indication. but that human overview of what's taking place in mental health systems is really crucial. And AMHS need to make, they are working in partnership with the police. The police are part of this process. The consultants are part of this. The nurses on the ward, the nurses, black nurses on the ward get the worst type of treatment in terms of how AMHS assess people and bring them on the ward. So these are interconnected issues that is responsibility for all of us. But honestly, I've been stopped by the police, I've been abused by the police, I've been restrained by the police. The memory of someone putting a boot in the back of your foot and actually being restrained is the most painful thing. I've got to make people aware of that, what we're actually talking about, because we can't get too theoretical about that. And AMHS need to actually talk to lived experiences about what is the real experience of abuse, and also empower them to challenge that.
Thanks, Colin. Particularly pertinent as well at a time when we see right care, right person being initiated across the country. It's really resonates with that experience at the moment. I wonder if any of our other panel members have any view on that particular comment before I just move to one last question.
I was just going to add, Jason, sorry, just quickly.
Please do.
Yeah, that was powerful, and just thinking about the black body and how, you know, how it's been described in relation to not only the professionals but the patients and people involved in the system, and the importance of. Yes, we can stand up and we need to speak up, and that is essential, but also, you know, protecting. And I think just using the word of Bell Hooks, where she talks about a community of resistance and the importance of developing a community of resistance in order to sustain ourselves and to build those communities in order to, you know, challenge collectively, because what each one of us speaking up individually, you know, is going to be tough in a force and that is so strong. You know, the Metropolitan Police Service, you know, the mental health service, all of these systems they're like armies. They're like you know, they're modern day gangs, you know, in terms of the violence and the force that they inflict. And I think if we are to stand up as professionals, if we are to really think about what that means to do that, you know, we can't do that in isolation, and we have to build those communities and that resistance amongst ourselves as well, and not be looking at others to do it for us as well. I do, you know, I didn't talk about coalition and allyship, and that is important, but I think sometimes we have to, you know, look at ourselves as well, and use, you know, our networks in order to kind of develop and protect, because the trauma, you know, as was mentioned, is yeah, it's unbearable, really unbearable.
Shantel, I think that's a really powerful note to end on. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. I've just seen Paul McCallery say that all the guest speakers today have been absolutely brilliant. Please share details if you have social media. It would be keep up with the amazing work that you're all doing, which I think is probably a sentiment echoed across the piece today. Thank you all so much for your contributions. It's a continuing story, and it's been a real privilege to put the spotlight on the AMP role, but to really look to understand the opportunities and the challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis from all of your different perspectives. Let's keep talking, let's be proactive, let's realise what actually is at our disposal. Delighted to see the anti-racism framework, and great to build those alliances across the system, etc. But most of all, I think, and I hope that we've all just taken away the really strong importance of appreciating the experience of people who are using services, who are in need of services, and particularly those who find themselves at a disadvantage as a result of the colour of their skin. Thank you all so much. Thank you. And you will see the recording on YouTube, and have a good day. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.